Good day, students. In this video, we're going to talk about finding something called quartiles. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at two different data sets and identify what's called the upper and the lower half of the data. The reason why we're doing two examples is one example has an odd number of numbers in the data set, and then the other one has an even amount in the data set. So you'll see we identify the halves of the data a little bit differently. So when we have an odd number of numbers in the data set, so for example, this has 9 numbers in the data set, the first thing we want to do is identify the median. So in this case, the median, they're already listed in order from least to greatest, so the median is going to be 9. This is also known as what's called the second quartile, or we abbreviate it as Q2. We'll talk a little bit more about the quartiles below, but this is also what's known as a second quartile. And this number, as defined previously, splits our data into the upper and the lower half. So once we have our median, everything that is above the median and everything that is below the median, those are the two halves of the data. So everything that's below the median is known as the lower half, and everything that is above the median is known as the upper half of the data. You'll notice that the median is not included. So median not included in this. It's kind of its own separate number. However, when we are looking at a set of even numbers, our median, remember, if we have an even amount, is going to be the average of the numbers that fall in the middle. So in this case, 4 plus 5 divided by 2, that's equal to 4.5. So that is technically our median of the data set. However, when I label the upper and lower half, in this case, I am going to include the two numbers I use to calculate the median. So if my median is 4.5, everything that is below 4.5, which also includes the 4 I use to calculate the median, that's going to be known as the lower half. And everything above 4.5, which also includes the 5 we use to calculate the median, that is going to be known as the upper half. So you can see it's a little bit different. When there's an odd number, we don't include the median. When we are calculating from an even number, we also don't include the median because it's not going to be one of the numbers in the data set, but we do include the numbers we use to calculate the median. So we can make a little note to include numbers we used to calculate median in the halves. So we use the numbers we include to calculate the median in the halves. So this is how we distinguish the upper and the lower half of the data. Now, once our data is split into the upper and lower half, we can calculate something called quartiles. So if the media splits the data into two halves, that's why it's called the second quartile. If we were to look at the medians of the upper and lower halves, that's splitting our data up into even smaller groups. And when we split it up into 4 groups, we are splitting it up into quartiles because this prefix quart means 4. So we have quartiles, we have quadrants, we have quarters. So that prefix kind of means to split into 4. So we have our second quartile is the median. The first quartile, which we abbreviate Q1, that is the median of the lower half of the data. And quartile 3 is when we find the median of the upper half of the data. So for the sake of showing you how that works, I'm going to use this as my example down below. I'm going to use this set of data. So I'm going to use this this lower and this upper half of the data, just to kind of show you. So if we are splitting our data into 4 groups to find the first quartile, I'm going to take the lower half. So from the example, that was 6, 7, 7, and 8. And if I was to find the median of this set, I am going to find the average between 7 and 7, but the average between 7 and 7 is just 7. 7 plus 7 divided by 2 would make 7. So this is the median of the lower half of the data. So this is my first quartile. the median of the upper half. My upper half from the example is going to be 9, 9, 11, and 13. So the median is going to be the average of 9 plus 11 divided by 2, which is going to be equivalent to 10. 9 plus 11 is 20. 20 divided by 2 is 10. So this is my third quartile. So we will use quartiles in a particular data graph that we're going to talk about next class. But now we have 3 values that split our data into 4 groups. So the first quartile is between the lowest amount and the first quartile, so between 6 and 7. Between the first quartile and the second quartile is the second group of data. Our second quartile was 9. From 9 to our third quartile of 10, that's our third group of data. And from 10 to the highest number in the data set, 13, that is our last quartile of data. So it kind of splits it into these 3 groups, which we'll show visually in what's called a box plot, which we'll talk about in our next video. The last thing that's kind of interesting with quartiles is if we look at what's called the interquartile range, or since that's a very long phrase, we abbreviate it IQR. That is when we look at the range between the first and the third quartiles. So typically when we calculate the range, we find the difference between the biggest and the smallest value in the data set. When we want to look at the range of quartiles, we take the biggest quartile, which is the third quartile, and the smallest quartile, which is the first quartile, and we find the range of those numbers. So 10 minus 7 in this case is going to be 3. So our interquartile range is 3. An interquartile range, when we look at a box plot, is going to show us kind of like where 50% of the data lies, where half of our data falls between. It falls between, in this case, these 3 numbers, between 7 and 10. And so again, all of these quartiles will show up a little bit better visually when we talk about how the data is distributed in something called a box plot. But this is how we calculate quartiles. We're essentially finding the median of the upper and lower halves, and we can calculate something called the interquartile range by finding the range of the biggest and the smallest quartile. So for your practice questions today, you are going to have 2 sets of data that I want you to identify the upper and lower half, the quartiles, and the interquartile range. So essentially, you need to take your data, make sure it's in order from least to greatest, identify your upper and lower halves based on what we talked about at the start of this video, calculate your median, and then find your median of your upper and lower halves, so your quartile 1 and quartile 3. And then I would also like you to find the range of your quartiles, so your interquartile range. If you are a little bit confused, maybe go watch the video one more time or try one of the problems, check your answers, go back and watch the video if you seem to be struggling. Ask your teacher for help if you also need some clarification. And I hope you guys have an awesome day. Bye.